Hi, it's Ben Callahan, founder of Sparkbox, Redwoods, and The Question. And it is Friday morning here in Ohio. And we had an amazing session yesterday on The Question with my friend Lauren. And I was just looking through the Fig Jam from some of the conversations that we captured in that deep dive for episode 55 of The Question. And I thought I should spend just a couple minutes kind of walking folks through some of what I walked away with. It was a really engaging conversation. So I'm going to share my screen here and just walk you through some of what we learned together and what we discussed. So the session was on managing your system's brain. And I think, the best way to explain what Lauren was after when she and I were chatting just about, what to talk about this week was to kind of look at how we structured the actual question. So right here in the FigJam file, you can kind of see what we said. I'm just going to read this out real quick. We said, "Hello, system thinkers. Welcome to episode 55 of The Question. As Lauren and I were preparing for this episode, she said something that really struck me when I asked her how she was doing. And she said, 'I'm learning to embrace the excruciating weight of systems thinking.'" Now, just that statement kind of really got me thinking, what is the impact of the exercise that I am doing constantly every day to strengthen my ability to be a systems thinker? What's the impact of that work out in the real world? And so that's what we were really trying to get at with this question. We ended up asking 3 specific questions of you all. The first was, on a scale from overwhelming to empowering, how has your understanding of systems impacted your life outside of work? Then we asked, how have your systems thinking skills helped or hindered you outside of design systems? And then finally, what techniques have helped you to focus on the areas where you have influence despite your understanding of their interconnectedness with areas where you don't? So that was kind of what we were going at. It's a very sort of high level, interpersonal, kind of like looking inward exercise that we went through over the last week or so answering this. We sent this out to almost 900 design system practitioners. We got almost 60 responses, and you can always jump into the FigJam file and click here to see the raw data if you want to do your own analysis of that. If you do that, I would love to hear what you see, what you pull from the answers. We do this every other week, and there's always something new that people are discovering as they kind of dive into that data. That first question was a little bit more quantitative in nature. So you can kind of see here, left side was overwhelming. My systems thinking brain sort of like makes things feel overwhelming on the left, and it empowers me, gives me like a superpower on the right. So the average here was about 3.5. You can kind of see in the analysis down here. And that's on the right side of the diagram, which is good. We started off, I just kind of asked Lauren, explain to me what she was thinking for this, like what was happening in her world that kind of led her to this as the topic for the week. And you can see she answered, she kind of referred to some of the things that are happening politically and socially in the world. She mentioned AI, of course. And I think there is this sort of like tension, as practitioners in the space where we're feeling like we're uncertain about what's happening in the world. And it also feels like there's robots coming for our jobs. and maybe that's extreme, I know not everybody feels that. But it does just feel like there's a lot of uncertainty around us. And the truth is, we still kind of got to show up, and we got to talk about hex values. We got to talk about tokens. We got to just we have to sort of be so tactical and make so many little decisions every day, even though there's all this happening. And so she expressed that she called it that altitude shift, that sort of like recognizing I've got all this stuff happening outside of work and then still having to show up and just be really present in the moment. So she said that was really hard. And I think a lot of folks resonated with that, with that assessment. She kind of went on to share that she feels like systems thinking is a muscle. It's something we practice and we rehearse and we work it out like we do any other muscle in our body. And over time it gets stronger, and that can be a superpower, that can be really valuable, but sometimes it's also hard to turn that off, right? I've experienced this for sure. I have this sort of process that I go through. I'm not great at reading a book from start to finish. And so when I'm reading books, I have like about a dozen sitting right here because I'm always interested in just sort of reading a little bit of each one, all in sort of one sitting. And it's a weird kind of mental mode that puts me into, where I'm constantly just connecting dots between writings of different authors that really didn't intend these things to be read together. And so it's kind of a funny spot to be, but it is in a way it's a way to work out that systems brain. It's a way to sort of like strengthen the muscles of connecting the dots. And so I find it really valuable for my work, but it does also lead me in my personal life into scenarios where, what we decide to have for dinner has an impact on all these other things in my brain, right? Because it's used to sort of like going out and looking for those connections. So sometimes it can be overwhelming for sure. We kind of opened it up to the attendees to dive in, and Taylor jumped in right away and he just said something I thought was really cool. He was like, "This is the first episode of the question where I didn't have like just an immediate answer, And I actually thought that was funny. When I looked through the answers, a lot of folks kind of expressed this idea that like they hadn't really thought about systems thinking in this way, right? Their work as a design system practitioner and how it impacts their lives outside of this. So I thought that was interesting. Lauren really keyed in on something here that some folks have spent some time thinking about and have recognized in themselves, but many folks said, wow, you're making me think about something I just hadn't really thought about. And so I thought that was really cool. And Lauren's response to that was kind of like, hey, I want to like expose other people in my organization to this web of thinking that I have, and in my personal life. I want folks to know you got to trust this intuition that I've been developing. And so we kind of got into a little conversation around storytelling. I loved this comment from Kevin in the chat in Zoom during the call. He said, "You're overthinking it, except what you call overthinking, I just call thinking." And I think a lot of folks felt like, yes, that's me, So these conversations are always fun when somebody kind of keys in on an idea that many of us have felt but haven't been able to give a voice to yet. So thanks, Kevin, for the great comment there. We had some interesting conversation around, I think Guy brought this up, that there's like a misconception that everyone who's a systems thinker should work on the design system. And I think he was trying to make the point that it's actually really valuable to have folks in the organization who have a good systems brain working on products too, right? That there's a lot of value that those folks can bring to the product specific space. So I actually thought that was really smart. And he kind of said, I wish everybody was a systems thinker, And that kind of got us into this whole thread of talking around, if we as practitioners acknowledge that we are systems thinkers, like our brains are kind of wired that way, what should we call folks who are not systems thinkers? Like people who just approach their problem solving in a different way. And we kind of landed on this idea of like a reductionist, right? Somebody who just quickly is able to sort of barricade their brain from thinking so much about the implications of a decision, the ripples of a decision into all these other areas, and who are able to just really quickly hone in on the core challenge, the core problem. We sort of spent quite a bit of time talking about this sort of systems approach and the reductionist approach. We talked about how we don't really operate in a vacuum. The organizations we work in are full of folks fully on that spectrum. Like some people are very much systems thinkers, some people are not. But the truth is, like, our job on the systems teams in particular is to reach out and try to figure out how to get all these folks working together. And so that is tough. That is like, it's hard work, and it's the stuff that I think we don't talk as much about, unfortunately. We're great at making little demos and tutorials on how to, build tokens in Figma or something, right? But we're not as much talking about these harder kind of challenges between interpersonal relationships and stuff. So, so that was really, really interesting. We had comments here recognizing like, hey, the ripples are real. The idea that like these things that I see are a reality, and other folks who maybe are a little bit more reductionist in their thinking, which can also be a superpower, don't necessarily see the ripples and don't believe us when we say those things. So it was an interesting contrast. What else here? Gosh, there was so much great conversation that we had. I would encourage you to jump into that FigJam file, because we did a really kind of a deep dive on the data itself, and you can see we pulled a bunch of interesting quotes that folks shared from question 2, which was that how has systems thinking helped or hindered you? And so you can kind of read through some of those key ones. There was a ton of great answers here. And then we also pulled some really interesting quotations from folks who answered that technique question number 3. I did love this one, this idea of like mind mapping. And we actually had a conversation, I think Taylor brought this up as well, where he talked about how in his world, when he identifies, one of those scenarios where things are going to ripple, and he feels that pressure from leadership to make a decision and to move quickly, one of his go-to exercises is to spend a little bit of time getting it written out like a one-page format, right? Just something that captures that for 2 reasons. One, of course, it's helpful to be able to then share that with leadership or with others who are kind of pushing for a decision in a certain way, and say, hey, I've done a quick analysis on this, and here's kind of where I see the impact being. And then also just internally for us, right? I think, especially for me, at least, I work this way where if I have something like that that's kind of in the back of my brain, it is taking up space there. And the sort of worry that surrounds my recognition of the interconnectedness of things keeps me from being as present and productive in other areas of my life. So taking the time to get it out onto paper, like generating that one pager, even just a note to myself sometimes is enough to sort of like get it out of my head, get it onto paper. And then I don't know, for some reason, like I feel like I can let it go enough to then sort of focus in other areas better. So we acknowledged, I think, as a community that that's a really valuable technique for folks who have this sort of systems brain and need to figure out how to be productive in lots of other ways as well. We also did some interesting grouping of the key concepts by frequency that were mentioned in each of these 2 questions. And so on the helps and hinders question, we got a lot of mentions. You can see almost 25. That's like just shy of half of our responses talked about this idea of like interconnectedness awareness. And that's, I think, comes back to the conversation about the ripples. The ripples are real, right? And so that, I think people saw that as both a strength, but also a source of that overwhelm that we were asking about in the first question. And so a lot of folks were feeling that. We also talked about a little bit about this analysis paralysis. One of the challenges of systems brains is that we see so many impacts to those decisions that sometimes it's kind of like standing, in the wine aisle at the store, right, where there's just like 1,000 bottles of wine. I don't know enough about this stuff. Like I have to analyze each of these bottles. It's that same moment of just like, I don't know, like what do I need to do? There's so many things that I see that could happen here. And then some of the stronger, like superpower types results or categories that we identified in the answers were, it's actually a really powerful way to solve problems. Folks with this systems brain are able to optimize processes really well. It gives us an interesting perspective and some great context. And there's also sort of an emotional impact to all this, which was maybe more on the challenge side. So we did that same kind of categorization based on frequency for the third question on the techniques, and found like a handful of things, right? Of course, we want to see that we want to recognize that the decisions we make have an impact. There is that systems side to it, but also in the moment, all we can do is work on the stuff we have some control and influence over. So that was, I think, really smart. This one came up a lot, time boxing and sort of setting those boundaries in a healthy way. I think a lot of people have learned about themselves that just taking, a set amount of time can really help. Where we're maybe in this scenario we're just talking about this analysis paralysis, the idea that we could say, hey, you know what? I've only got 3 days to make this decision. So I need to make a plan to have a decision by the end of that time and figure out who I got to involve in the conversation, figure out who, how we need to prioritize, all of that stuff. But just setting that time box, establishing some of those boundaries for yourself can be really, really helpful. We talked about a couple little prioritization frameworks, just spending some time developing your own mindfulness, learning how to be present in the moment can be helpful. And then I loved this one. This came up, eight or so folks mentioned this in their answers. Just the idea that bringing other folks into the conversation can be really valuable. I think in particular, we had some great conversation around the sort of healthy friction that results when we invite some of those folks who don't have that systems brain, right? We use that word reductionist, but folks who are able to really quickly hone in on like core problems, core challenges. Those people can be really nice to bounce ideas off of with us, right? If they come willing to sort of hear your systems approach and you come willing to hear them help you focus things, that is a really healthy rub, a really healthy friction. And so I love that people acknowledge that in their answers. And then lastly, we did just like a quick analysis to say like, hey, what were the pros and cons of systems thinking? So if any of this is of interest to you, I would encourage you to jump into that FigJam file. I'm going to be working on writing a little wrap up, but it was a really great conversation, and major thanks to Lauren, to all the folks who contributed. We had so many people really chime in. Ginger was there, Taylor, Guy, Tony Ann, Jesse, Kelly, Christy, Kevin, Peter, a bunch of people really jumped in and added a lot to the conversation. So thanks as usual to those of you who took the time to answer and who took the time to show up yesterday and really dive in with the convo. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate the engagement. Hope you all have a great weekend. Talk to you soon.